Sam Harris is a smart guy and a great communicator, but man, he really needs to spend some time in this book. Let me tell you what I mean. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I'm going to do something with this video that I haven't done, at least on my channel yet, which is I'm actually going to respond to another conversation that happened on YouTube and podcasts, which is conversation between Glenn Loury and Sam Harris on The Glenn Show. I'm not going to feed any clips of it in the middle of this video. Instead, I'm just going to post a link to that conversation in the show notes in case you're not familiar with it. But I am a fan of Glenn Loury. I follow his podcast and conversations, and he recently had Sam Harris, who notoriously may be known for being one of the new atheists in the early 2000s especially. But just recently he had a conversation with Glenn on The Glenn Show. I think it was a couple weeks ago, as I record this at least. And it was a really interesting conversation. And the reason I want to focus on it here, and the reason that I just felt a real compulsion to have this video put together, is because of the last section of the conversation, about the last 15 minutes or so. I think it starts around the 48-minute mark. You can go to the Glenn Show YouTube channel through the link below and watch it. And I'd recommend you do if you're not familiar with it. But I heard it. The first time I heard it, I've listened to it multiple times, just that last section. The first time I heard it, my mind was kind of blown by how much of Charles Taylor's cultural theory and philosophy is just on display all over this conversation. And I went back and re-listened to it a few times to just affirm that my first reaction was correct. The reason I want to do this video is because I'm currently working through Charles Taylor's book on this channel. I've already done 2 videos on it. And I just couldn't help but think about all of the concepts in Charles Taylor's A Secular Age and how they applied to what Sam and Glenn were trying to articulate and discuss on The Glenn Show, namely the place of religion and belief and transcendence and mystery in the modern life. And so what I want to do in this video is I wrote down some quotes, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some quotes from the conversation, and I'm going to attempt to explain how they connect to concepts in Charles Taylor's work. And by doing so, hopefully shed a little bit of light on at least one way to think about what Sam and Glenn were talking about. I don't put myself forward as smarter than either of them by any means. I should have started by saying this. I think that they're both pretty brilliant. I obviously disagree with Sam Harris on certain metaphysical ideas and stuff, but whatever. I think that they're very smart. And so this is not a critique per se, although it is a little bit of a critique of Sam Harris, I guess. It's not a critique of the conversation. It's more just a kind of an analysis of the conversation and connecting it to Charles Taylor's work. And I do, at the end of the day, I really think if Sam Harris read Charles Taylor, maybe he has. I don't think he has based on the way he talks, but if he really wrestled with some of Charles Taylor's concepts, I think they would. It would be interesting. So, okay, enough of a preamble, enough of a wind-up. So here we go. Something that you can pause this here and you can watch that part of the conversation if you want to get an idea of it first before I step through it. Okay, some of the language that Sam Harris was using, they were talking about, Glenn poses the question just to talk about God is where it starts, and then the conversation pivots from there into talk about belief and spiritual practices, and Sam Harris is really big on meditation and quasi-Buddhist kind of, self-transcendence, self-emptying kind of practices. And so they talk a lot about that and what that means. But the first concept I want to start with here is when Sam Harris says things like, right at the beginning of the conversation, when he's critiquing religious approaches, he says things like, quote, "We know too much about the world to take religion seriously." He says, we know too much about, quote, the merely human origin of the texts that these religions hold to. And then when he starts talking about consciousness, he uses the language of we haven't explained it yet. And the yet there is super important. So all of these things point to what Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame. And that's the first concept, is the immanent frame. And so Sam Harris's language is squarely composed of immanent frame language, immanentizing a concept of the world. And so he's assuming language like we know too much about the world, he's assuming that the world, there is no room for transcendence anywhere really in the world. Although he talks about self-transcendence later, which I'll get to in a minute. But in terms of there actually being even the possibility of something actually divine or something outside of what is immanent or what is measurable and explainable and empirically kind of explainable and analyzable. The assumption, the operating assumption apparently for Sam Harris is that it's just not there, and that is exactly what Charles Taylor talks about as the immanent frame, meaning that culturally we've built an immanent frame around our conception of the world and then kind of moved into it. So we built it up and then moved into it, and so thereby we assume there is nothing outside of this immanent frame that we've built. And that's kind of was the first thing that jumped off the page, so to speak, for me when they were talking, is that, oh wow, Sam Harris is articulating what it means to live in the immanent frame. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about is when they start talking about the concepts of meditation and what the positive goods that can be experienced, in Sam Harris's view, the positive goods that can be experienced when you master things like suffering, or when you kind of interrogate your own thoughts and spend time meditating and spend time realizing the kind of inner psychological workings of your mind and begin to demonstrate some mastery of that, and thereby you reduce your suffering. Transcend the self is the way he talks about it. He uses language about experiencing the good stuff of kind of psychological experiences, like human psychological experiences, and this is what he proposes is the unifying content of all of religions. Essentially what all religions are trying to get at is to grasp like the good stuff of human psychology, and so reducing suffering, he uses the language of experiencing unconditional love, and then of course he brings up experiencing self-transcendence. Well, these are ways of getting at what this is the second Charles Taylor concept I want to talk about, which is fullness. Charles Taylor talks about where we experience fullness. And so that's the language he uses. Sam Harris uses self-transcendence or unconditional love, but he's talking about experiencing, it also says, quote, the good stuff, which I think that's a good way to talk about fullness. It's just the good stuff, experiencing goodness, like the good as such, experiencing that, tasting that, encountering that. Sam Harris talks a lot about first-person experience in this conversation, but he's using it to get at this, like the experiencing the good. And that's what Charles Taylor talks about as fullness. But interesting, Charles Taylor's project is to examine how we have moved around where fullness can be found in our own ideas of it. And that kind of tees up the next thing I want to talk about, which is how Sam Harris is, within the immanent frame, that's an important backdrop, within the immanent frame, Sam Harris's language is all about internal to oneself. So inside oneself is where one can experience fullness and get at the good stuff, or get at what he talks about as the far end of kind of a positive human psychological work and transformation. He actually uses language of transformation, which is very religious. A lot of religious concepts talk about transforming or transformation of the self, or sanctification in Christian language. So fullness for Sam Harris is located squarely within oneself, not outside, which is a huge shift in Charles Taylor's theory, a huge shift in kind of human conception, is that it used to be from outside of us, and Glenn touches on that in a minute, which I'll get to. It used to be from outside of us. Now if it's all squarely within us, that's the only place it could be found. And so fullness has moved from outside to in. Sam Harris is just articulating that. He's just saying that's just where it is, and that's how, if you have any hope at getting at the good stuff, getting at fullness, you need to look inwards. And that gets to the third concept which I want to talk about, which is the buffered self, the buffered self. So Sam Harris uses language in the conversation about, like, he says the voice in your head, kind of paying attention to the voice in your head, paying attention to, again, positive human psychological experiences. That is within the immanent frame, and then the movement of fullness into human selves. This is what Charles Taylor calls now the buffered self, and this is another layer on top of it, which is to say that we are kind of intrinsically protected from anything outside of ourselves, meaning that spiritual power, spiritual meaning, something like an unconditional love, cannot impinge upon us from outside. It needs to be found inside, right? It cannot be something that we encounter outside of us that pushes in on us, but it's something that we need to look for within ourselves. And that's because we've built the buffered self within the immanent frame, within the disenchanted world, right? And that's the fourth concept. So the immanent frame, we built up, we moved into it. We've moved fullness within ourselves. We have conceived of ourselves as buffered, which can only happen when the world has been disenchanted. So there's no spiritual power intrinsically in anything outside of ourselves. If there is meaning in anything outside of ourselves in this conception, it's only there because we project it onto it. We project spiritual power onto things or other people or experiences, but it's not actually intrinsically there, and it can't impinge on us regardless of our conceptions of it. So Sam Harris, when he talks about mastering the voice in your head, experiencing positive human psychology, he's just narrating what Charles Taylor has already explained is the condition of the modern age, which is we've moved fullness inside ourselves. We believe we're buffered. There's no spiritual power outside of us because it's all disenchanted, and so we need to find the meaning there. Just a couple more. Now, within all of this, moving in the immanent frame, but grasping at kind of these concepts, Charles Taylor has this concept that I think is really strong, really, really strong in this interchange between Glenn and Sam. And that is the concept of cross pressure. That's the next concept I want to bring up. Cross pressure. And what Charles Taylor means by that is something like, we've moved into the immanent frame, but we're kind of haunted by the longing for transcendence, and by we're haunted by what we've lost by moving into the immanent frame, and by conceiving ourselves as buffered and disenchanting the world. We're haunted by what we've lost, and so at times that haunting kind of grabs us, or at times we even experience things like a transcendent experience, or a sense of maybe something that was divine, or maybe something that was outside of the buffered self that had meaning. We get a taste of that, and we wonder, could that have been actually divine? Could that have been something like God? Could that have been a valid, legitimate, like, taste of divine love or divine transformation? That pressure that's created by living in the immanent frame, but by tasting transcendence, that's what Charles Taylor calls cross pressure. And this is something that he would argue all kind of secular moderns experience, which is the pressure between, is this thing true or real? But then the pressure to the other side to say, no, it's not, because it's not scientifically valid. Like, you can't validate it scientifically in a lab, which is kind of back to the very beginning of the immanent frame that Sam Harris was talking about. But this is where I was kind of blown away by stuff. I was really, really shocked. When Sam Harris talks about consciousness in this conversation, he actually uses two words that knocked me over. He uses the word mystery and miracle. He actually used the word miracle when describing. I don't know if that was a slip. If it was a slip, it would just affirm Charles Taylor's idea that it was Sam Harris was cross-pressured in that moment. To try to articulate something like about the power of consciousness, you kind of have to, if you're in the immanent frame, you kind of have to grasp at transcendent language, but you know that it's almost not valid to use it because of the immanent frame that you live in. And so when he used the word miracle, I think my eyebrows kind of shot up when I heard it, because I thought, wow, he is actually using a really explicitly spiritual, religious term, miracle, to talk about the mystery of consciousness that he admits will probably never get explained. And he even says, this really highlights cross pressure in my mind, he even says, even if we could achieve some sort of scientific explanation of it, it would be deflationary, is the term he uses. It would be unsatisfactory, because we're haunted by transcendence, and we're haunted by the divine, and something that there must be something more beyond the immanent frame. This is cross pressure on display. One more example of cross pressure that I want to point out is when he then talks about, he loops back around to it, and he says later on he's talking about kind of what he sees as the invalid ways that religions cloak things in doctrine and sectarianism. He uses the word sectarian a ton. The invalid ways that religions do that, but then he says, he loops it back around. He says that religions are grasping at this kind of positive human psychological experience, but it needs to be brought into 21st century scientific language. But then he says, but then you can't ever discount the first person human experience, which can't really ever be explained scientifically. And so there you go. There's cross pressure, just moving back and forth. So that I just found really fascinating. And then I just want to highlight one more concept that was especially highlighted when Glenn kind of steps in and pushes back on some of what Sam Harris was saying. Glenn narrates a tiny bit of his autobiography, and he talks about his own conversion into a really, really what sounds like a very conservative, charismatic black church context in America. And he says that he experienced something. He uses the phrase, I experienced something that was outside of myself. And that's really crucial, because that points back to the buffered self and the cross pressure in the immanent frame kind of concepts. He experienced something that was outside of himself, that wasn't just his own mastery of his own psychological kind of maneuverings and the voice in his head. He experienced something that seemed to be genuinely outside of his own buffered self. And then he goes on to say, he says to Sam, after Sam has talked a lot about kind of these concepts, he goes on to say, I don't see any room for meaning in the whole portrait you've laid out. I'm paraphrasing that a little bit, but he says to Sam, he says, I don't see any room for this in what you've just described to me. Like any room for deep meaning, any room for being webbed into a community, any room for experiencing something that's outside of your own human psychology and kind of your own efforts to master your own suffering. He says, I don't see any room for this. And this is the last Charles Taylor concept, is what I would label as what he says is the malaise of modernity. He talks about malaise. He talks about the kind of blah, the blah that we all feel as we're caught in these cross-pressuring forces within the immanent frame in the disenchanted world. And so when he says, I don't see any room for meaning, he's expressing the malaise that so many modern people feel, right? So many modern people feel as we're caught in these cross-pressuring forces in the kind of a secular age that we're in. And Sam Harris actually, in a sense, agrees with him, and he said we suffer a deficit of this in secular society, a deficit of kind of the community and the webbing into a community and the experiencing meaning from outside of yourself. And so Sam essentially agrees with him that there is this malaise kind of around all of these all of these experiences and the efforts of secular modern people to grasp onto it. And so wow, I want to spend a few minutes unpacking some of that and connecting it to Charles Taylor's work, because I thought it was a powerful illumination of exactly what Charles Taylor is arguing, of the condition that we all find ourselves in kind of the modern, late modern, postmodern age when it comes to experiences like transcendence, grasping at mystery and miracle, and wondering kind of what our place is in all that and how do we actually pursue the good, with kind of in the immanentizing of the frame that we've constructed around ourselves that kind of lops off any kind of aspect of a divinity or possibility of divinity reaching us. But there you go. There are some concepts from Charles Taylor, from a secular age in particular, that hopefully illuminate and highlight the tensions and the cross-pressuring and the what was happening in that interchange between Glenn and Sam, which I think is extremely insightful, extremely representative of what a lot of people experience as they kind of chase down questions about meaning and transcendence and religion and spirituality in our context today. So I hope you found that helpful, interesting. If you've read Charles Taylor, maybe this was helpful to kind of connect some dots for you. Or if you haven't read Charles Taylor, maybe this will cue you on to him. I am going through a secular age on this channel right now, kind of slowly going a chapter at a time. So if that sparks up any questions or reactions or thoughts for you, I'd love to hear about that. So go ahead and post them below. And of course, thanks for taking some time to watch this.